I'm Leslie Elliott Boyce of the Radical Center.
And I'm Andrew Hartz of the Open Therapy Institute.
It's really nice to see you, Andrew, and to have the chance to talk with you again. And today we are going to, I'm very interested in where this goes because you are going to do some framing of Freud's model. We're going to talk a little bit about Freud, and I don't have a great wealth of information or education on Freud. I have sort of a cursory overview from my
It's a pretty
education.
unique, even for people who know about Freud, I think that we're going to keep the conversation very relatable, very clinically useful, and probably different from anything that they've heard before. Um,
Well, I'm certainly intrigued, and I look forward to hearing and learning. And do you want to start by maybe talking a little bit about what Open Therapy Institute is offering? Just mention the workshops quickly before we launch in.
That's right. We have workshops, continuing education workshops that are listed on our website. Go to opentherapyinstitute.org and click on workshops. We have 4 workshops coming up this fall. We also have a membership where you get discounts on workshops, opportunities for therapy referrals, and members events where you can connect to others, which is great for students and graduate students and people in the field. And if you're interested in therapy referrals, we have a really excellent group of well-vetted therapists who are open on all viewpoint and values issues. So please just go to our contact page, click therapy referrals, tell us where you're located and what you're looking for, and we'll pair you with a therapist. One other thing I'll say is for people who want to support the Open Institute, please promote our workshops and our membership and our therapy referrals. We're going to have emails going out about that, social media posts about that. So please follow us on social media, sign up for our mailing list. That's at the bottom of our homepage of our website.
Wonderful. Thank you. And I look forward to the workshops and look forward to seeing how it all unfolds. So thank you very much. And now, Freud, he's a divisive figure and yet very foundational to our modern psychology or understanding of human psychology.
Right. I would like to, that's right. There are some things that I like. I'll just start that I don't like about Freud. For Freud, everything came down to the Oedipus complex and his theory of psychosexual development and psychosexuality. If you didn't believe in his psychosexual model, you weren't psychoanalytic. And if you look at the history of the rifts that he had and who he broke with, about whom, it's mostly about that. And I don't like his psychosexual model. I think it's kind of weird, and uh, it's kind of a strange model that I don't find so clinically useful. Um, but the thing about Freud that I'll say that I think is his most valuable insight is what I wanted to talk about today, which is basically his general model. And it's not talked about as much because it's in the background of everything he wrote, but he really didn't have good papers that in an accessible way spelled out this model and how it worked. And so the best way to explain this is to go back to Freud's time, early in his career, the middle of the 19th century. At that time, they did not know what neurons were. Neurons are the cells that make up our nervous system and our brain, and they didn't know what they were, and or how they worked exactly. So they thought of nerves. They knew about nerves, and they thought of nerves as like tiny little pipes that would convey an energy or a substance or a filament like steam in a steam engine. So if I hit my hand, I'm actually pushing this fluid or steam up those tiny little pipes up to my brain so that it gets the message. So presumably, if I hit my hand harder, the message would go faster up to my brain and there'd be more steam going up my brain. If I burn my hand on a fire, it's actually boiling the steam or boiling the fluid, and that goes up to my brain and it says I'm burning. And so basically we're like these giant steampunk kind of contraptions where that's how we move and sense things, is by shifting this steam around. Now, Freud developed his thinking under that model, which isn't how neurons work. That's not how neurons work. But it ends up being, I think, a very conceptually useful frame. So, for example, he might think about how somebody might feel one feeling to avoid feeling another feeling. Or maybe you'd think to avoid feeling, or act to avoid thinking. Or energy could get concentrated on an object or an image, like a red hat,
Mm-hmm.
that gets loaded with meanings, and maybe it's deprived from another area. You could get buildups of steam that would lead to like a hysterical fit, or you could get blockages that lead to depletion. So there's something about the way that he conceptualized this framework that, even though it's not anatomically how neurons work, it's a conceptually useful framework because you do find processes like this happening. A good example might be like if somebody can't tolerate feeling sad, they might go to anger. So they're stuck feeling too much anger because their ability to feel sadness is blocked. And if they can tolerate feeling sadness, it takes the pressure off the anger so that they can have a healthier type of assertiveness without going to anger. Well, but the opposite could happen. If they can't feel assertiveness, then maybe they're stuck feeling depressed because they can't tolerate the anger. So if they can tolerate being assertive, there's some pressure taken off the depression. Or they might be anxious to feel depression or anger whenever they come up. So maybe that would lead to anxiety or even panic because they can't tolerate those feelings. So this really shapes almost everything that Freud wrote, is rooted to an extent in this model. So think about, I guess, and so for Freud and Jung is a little bit different, but this steam in the steam engine, it's literally driving the machine forward. It's drive. It's what's powering your machinery. And the main drives of any machine, like, are, according to Darwin, to survive and reproduce. So the life drive, the sexual, to survive and reproduce. And so that's pushing the steam forward, pushing the psyche to move the gears. Psyche is this kind of force. And so think about Freud's theory of dreams. Like, in a nutshell, it's that dreams are wish fulfillments. They're disguised wish fulfillments. You want something, it comes out when your defenses are down in sleep. It's disguised through symbols sometimes, but it's always some type of disguised wish fulfillment because that's what the psychic energy is doing. Think about a joke. Like, for Freud, jokes are all about wish fulfillment. You want to say something mean, but you can't, so you disguise it in a joke. The art of the joke, the reason why jokes are funny is there's some type of repressed wish, and the art of the joke disguises it and surprises the unconscious, so it works past the defenses so that that wish can be expressed. And that's the cathartic, gratifying. That's why you laugh, because it's pleasurable to release that repressed wish. Things can get displaced into art or slips. Another example, like, think about the machinery. You want to do this one thing, but unconsciously the steam is pushing you to do this other thing. So maybe you're angry at somebody, you're at a party, you're bringing their drink to them. Here's your drink. You want to be nice to them, but you actually hate them. So you slip and you spill the drink on them accidentally. It's that wish to hurt them overtaking you, or saying something, I didn't mean to say that. That it's this unconscious wish is coming through. Two wishes can be combined in what's called a compromise formation. Maybe you have like two different wishes are kind of combined into the same action. and all the defense mechanisms are rooted in this. It takes energy to kind of keep certain information out of consciousness, to keep certain feelings or desires or thoughts out of consciousness. And he's got tons of jargon. Like when the steam gets concentrated in a particular area, that's called the cathexis. That's where the steam gets concentrated. And maybe it's a particular preoccupation you have, or a particular thing that you can't stop thinking about, or a feeling you can't stop feeling, or a behavior you can't stop engaging in. And then there's an anticathexis. Maybe there's a place that's like blocked and actually not getting this steam. So I guess like his whole model and his whole treatment is rooted in this. The idea of free associating on the couch. What you're doing is just let the steam flow, and you're going to find the blockages. And then you want to identify those to kind of help the patient work through those blockages so that the steam can flow in a more well-balanced way. So mental health isn't, it's about the capacity to feel the full range of feelings and full range of behaviors without those blockages.
So he's describing this based on an anatomical understanding of biology. And so his biological, literal facts are not in accord with what we understand now.
He knew it was clear early on in his career that neurons worked in a different way, that there are these electrochemical signals called action potentials, and that there's synapses and things like that. That I think somebody won the Nobel Prize for that in like 1902 or something like that, or maybe 1898 or something. So really before psychoanalysis really got going. But he didn't necessarily take it literally, as he knew he had kind of developed thinking along these lines, and he kept using this metaphor. Now, his metaphors here are pretty loose. He'll sometimes talk about the steam as like pressure or forces, and other times talk about it as like charge, like it's like an electromagnetic thing. And his metaphors are loose. He'll talk about homeostasis and balance and charge and discharge and things like that. And it's not, the metaphors aren't entirely worked out. But it does kind of operate as like a metaphorical level where he kind of is like, I'm seeing this type of thing happening for people. So even though it doesn't fit how we understand neurons, there still may be some processes like this that make sense somehow. So he kind of kept the model, but he was constantly revising the model, constantly changing it, constantly complicating it. And like, for example, like you might think that if the pressure is unpleasurable and the discharge is pleasurable, the best life is going to be lots of discharge. And so lots of sex and lots of aggression is going to lead to a very pleasurable life, which of course it doesn't. And so, and lots of aggression doesn't cure people. It doesn't, lots of sex doesn't cure people. And so there was a sense of a need for nuance, and he would be puzzled by things like, why does somebody have a nightmare? Shouldn't that's what wish is that gratifying? So he developed new ideas about repetition compulsion or the death drive or things like that to try to explain. And his model would just keep getting more and more complicated, and it never got tied together in a systematically coherent way. So it's just this, at the end of it, he had this development of new ideas that he would just keep coming up with, and they sit together oddly, and they were never really tied up together.
And yet, as you say, if you take it as a loose metaphor, his theory about blockages and displacements and concentrations really does make a lot of sense with the way that people behave, and with the way that we we tend to displace our energies in certain directions based on things that we're holding back or that we're not allowing ourselves to experience or feel.
Yes. And I think especially if you're working as a therapist, and it's a worthwhile lens to kind of think about, why is this person stuck on this emotion?
Mhm.
And what about the other emotions that they might be feeling? You know, somebody's really stuck on anxiety. Is it maybe that they actually have a lot of anger
Mhm.
that's not really being uh, communicated in a constructive way? You know, or if they're really fixated on a certain behavior, is there an unconscious wish or something
Mhm.
else there? You know, what so I think that this broad framework is, if you're doing it in an empathic, collaborative way with the patients, I think it is a really powerful clinical tool. It kind of challenges people to look at the things they aren't feeling, and which can rebalance when they're stuck feeling. Most people coming into therapy are feeling too much of one thing and not
Mhm.
of some others. So it's just such a common issue. And this framework is often really helpful for that.
It's really fascinating to think about the steam, just going back to the literal discussion of that. And then what is that we're actually describing if we use steam as the concrete metaphor for the real energy or the thing? Is it emotion? Is it drive? Do we have a
Well,
sense of
right.
that? Yeah.
Yeah. What is the steam? Where does it go when it's discharged? What
Yeah.
creates it?
Yeah.
You know, it's it's not exactly the wish, but it's the force of wishes.
Mm.
It's like it's there's this whole, but it is like it's this whole and it has, just to be clear, like it does have a lot of a lot of, you know, conceptual problems that I think Freud wrestled with and couldn't really get together. Jung moved away from psychosexuality, and he saw psychic energy as a much more general thing. It
Mm.
didn't have to just be wishes. It could just be like the stuff that's animating thoughts and behaviors, and it's more general.
Mhm.
Um, I think that's an easier way to think of it, um, than having this specific survive and reproduce
Mhm.
motivation behind it.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, but let me uh, yeah, I think there's a kind of sense behind it too, that there is like it one thing that I like about it is it doesn't posit that the goal of therapy is like constant happiness or something.
Mhm.
It's actually a balance of the range of human experiences that are there. And there's really like a sense of like if something frustrating happens, or if you have a loss, or if you have a stress, or if you have something scary happening, or whatever it is, there is a there is a normal pattern of an emotional response to that that's kind of within homeostasis. Like it makes sense to be stressed for a little while about it, or
Mhm.
worried about it for a while, or to grieve for a period of time, and then to let it go. And that harmony in the system requires kind of letting it happen and then letting it go.
Mhm.
But if you can't do one or the other, you get blocked, and
Mhm.
then you'll get stuck not being able to let it go, or you won't let it happen. And that can come out in another, it's going to come out another way. Um, there's a certain balanced, reasonable way to respond to things. It's not like every little thing requires a full, you know, big emotional display, but that there's a kind of balanced way to respond to things and then let them go. Um, so it's a nice model that it kind of avoids the trap of like trying to help patients like never feel anxiety or always feel happy about things.
Mhm. Mhm. But it reminds me of John Sarno's theory of repressed anger and regional pain syndromes. So I wonder how
Oh,
much Sarno took from Freud in that. That's very interesting.
it sounds very Freudy.
Yeah.
And, you know, to think about pain or somatic symptoms or uh, behavioral things being shaped by fatigue. You know, why are
Mhm.
people having fatigue? You know, is it because you have like a trauma, or something like that, and it's getting displaced, or
Mhm.
frustration is getting displaced into fatigue?
Mhm.
Or are you like depleted from something else? I mean, for his model of grief is interesting, or one reading of his model of grief is that you you have an attachment to somebody else,
Mhm.
and in that you're both supporting each other. Then they go, and
Mhm.
you're still giving energy, but you're not getting it back. So you
Okay.
get depleted,
Mhm.
and so there's this like it's a versatile way of thinking. For depression, like a
Mhm.
common theory is like it's anger towards turned inwards. Like you're angry, but you
Mhm.
can't tolerate that, so you direct it towards yourself, and that becomes guilt and then depression.
Mhm. Mhm.
um Paranoia. So paranoia is another interesting one. The classic paradigm is I hate you, or I love you.
Mhm.
That's intolerable. I hate you. That's intolerable. You hate me.
Mhm.
And then it can spiral to everybody hates me. They're out to get me. The world is going to end. That's paranoia. But it's rooted in this repressed need for closeness, or this repressed wish for connection.
Connection.
Um, and so a lot of like paranoia sometimes has this like sexual component to it. Everybody wants to have sex with me, or sometimes there's something like that, or everybody wants to have sex with my wife, or whatever it is. It's
Mhm.
like there's this, it can take on these weird flavors based on what's being what's being repressed. And I think going back to kind of like maybe like a theme of the podcast of like our discussions are more about socio-political issues in the field. And I think once people know Freud's general model, they can think with more sophistication about what's happening culturally. And when you notice something that's really mystifying, you can start to think about, oh, why is that happening? What does it mean?
Mhm.
Um, uh, One thing that I've been, and we may have talked about this in the past, but one thing that I've been really interested in is like white people who hate white people,
Mhm.
because they're such an influential social force, and it's such a strikingly strange preoccupation, to have like a really vitriolic hatred towards white people, and to be so flamboyantly embracing, demeaning and aggressive and hostile characterizations of your own. And it just pulls for like psychoanalysis of like,
Mhm.
what's happening here? This is interesting. And when
Mhm.
you think about it from a Freudian perspective, it does make sense that it's like it's a defense against something else. I would say it's a defense against their own racial hatred, that they have racial hatred towards other races, maybe Black people in particular. They can't tolerate it, and they turn it into hatred towards their
Mhm.
own group, because it has such an unusual flavor to it. It's like it's uh it's often counterproductive, it's often strange, it's often full of like demeaning attitudes and beliefs towards Black people. It's often full of an idealization of white people, strangely. Like white people are responsible for everything in the world and have the power to do everything in the world, and Black people have no power and can't do anything. And math is racist, and they're just full of these like incredibly condescending
Mhm.
beliefs. I would say like racist beliefs,
Mhm.
but that gets turned into its opposite. Um, you could think about things happening in the sex or gender world this way. You can think about things happening politically that are related to this. So I think it's just good to have frameworks like this handy, because they are really versatile at trying
Mhm.
to formulate what's happening culturally and what's happening with different people.
Yeah, I like that. It's like you can use this to ask what imbalances does this phenomenon represent for the individual or culturally, perhaps.
Right. Right. That there's some type of, what is it that they're afraid of feeling,
Mhm.
or that they can't tolerate feeling, that they've channeled into this other dysfunctional behavior.
It's so interesting to hear this to hear you talk about this framework, this model, because it's one of the, I can't help but think he spent his life revising and reworking it. What would we have had if he had been able to continue to build on this decade after decade? What realizations and what pattern connections would a mind like his have made over time had he had more than one lifetime to work on this model?
Well, there is a place where he really wrestled with this is a paper called The Project for a Scientific Psychology.
Mm.
And he never published it, but you can get it now. And it's attempting to kind of like explain in minute detail what's happening at the neurological levels to create different types of experiences. And I have to tell you, it is impenetrable. It's so complicated and full of, these coins countless new jargon terms for different things. And it's like about how like quantity creates quality because of psi and phi energies. And it's like, it's so, and he has these diagrams that are just insane. And I can see why he never published it. But I think we have not figured out a way now, and maybe he would have, but we haven't figured out a way to take this constellation of insights that I do think often is true for people and really map it on to our current understanding of the brain and neurons and psychology. And so it gets lost. And it's all stuff it's really hard to measure this stuff, because if I'm thinking somebody comes in and they have excessive anger, they've got an anger issue, they've got anxiety, let's say it's an anxiety issue. This model doesn't tell you what's going on. It kind of says maybe they're stuck on anxiety because they don't want to think about something, or they don't want to remember something, or they don't want to feel something. We don't know what that is. And so we have to have a conversation to see where that goes. And then over a period of time, maybe you find what that is and they maybe connect to it. And then their anxiety is not going to go to zero. Their anxiety is going to go down to closer to a normal level. And it may take some time for them to really work through that process to where it's balanced in a way that's closer to a normal level of anxiety we would expect for people. So you have to figure it out. It's kind of like a pathway of like, these are places you might want to look and think about, but there's no necessary answer. And some, as you and I both know, there's some therapists who have a really uncanny sense for these things and can really say, I think this is what you're not feeling, or well, this is what you might be feeling, or something. They can find those things. They can read between the lines and find that stuff. And there's other people who are really bad at it, and they just kind of lead patients in this aimless way, and they don't really know where they're going. So all those things make it so hard to measure this. It's so hard to pin down. And then even if you get to an answer that both people agree to at the end, is that really what happened? And how do you prove that?
I guess I kind of hope we never can measure it. I hope in a way that we never break people down into that scientific level understanding where we bring you in and hook you up to the angometer and find out exactly where you're, whatever. I like the mystery of being a human being, the mystery of life.
And for Freud, if they had that and they told people, this is what it says, this is it, that doesn't do anything for them because they have to actually find it and work through it. That's what undoes the blockage.
So there's still that individual complexity.
You still have to go through the process. And it's why if the therapist just tells the patient the answer, why that's so unhelpful. That you actually have to like kind of come to a mutually agreed upon answer through a process of exploration. If you just are told, you don't work through it. Yeah.
Well, this is really fascinating. I think that even if the specific details of his theory don't still hold up over time for us in terms of steam and et cetera, the imagery is still very useful. And I think that metaphorically, it makes a lot of sense. And
Yeah.
It
I
was
would
something I
say
didn't know.
I think like thinking about how to like apply it for a second.
Hmm.
Like I
Hmm.
kind of talked about racial issues, but even the gender stuff that we were just talking
Hmm.
about, right?
Hmm.
I mean, like what 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 happens to men who suppress their desires to be masculine in that authentic way? Where do those go? Do they become depletion? Do they become aggression?
Hmm.
Do they become, what happens to that? But it's interesting because you might actually find for a lot of young men, and this is why it's important to have discussions about these issues. For a lot of young men, it's like, I just want to live at home and I don't want to grow up or something.
Hmm.
And you're like, what's going on? And you can give them all the tools and help and skills or whatever, and they're still stuck. And it's like, maybe there's something here that they're not letting themselves become a man
Hmm.
because there's somehow they've internalized the sense that that's wrong.
Hmm.
Uh, or they can't get over that blockage of the way that that's been uh shut down for them. And so it's important to be aware of these types of dynamics because it might not even be on the patient's mind
Hmm.
that letting yourself be who you are as a man and letting yourself have a positive, assertive, authentic sense of masculinity is connected to why you're depressed.
Hmm.
And it's not like that's not for the therapist to impose on the patient, but it is something that could be explored, and the
Hmm.
patient may or may not be open to it. It may or not fit that particular patient. But
Hmm.
these types of forces that we're talking about in all the other episodes about how cancel culture impacts people, or how self-censorship impacts people, or gender or racial issues and how they impact people. It's all, if you look at it through the lens of this model, you're going to see things about how they play out psychically for people, and can impact symptoms and behaviors, sometimes in unexpected ways.
Hmm. Hmm. It's very useful for pattern recognition and sort of observing these phenomena.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much for the lesson on Freud, and I hope people really
Happy to
enjoy
share
that.
it. Happy
Yeah,
to share it. Yeah,
yeah,
thanks much. And
excellent.
hopefully we can refer to it now, maybe
Going forward,
not go into such a deep explanation, but just refer to it because it's so useful.
I agree. I think so. Thank you very much for that, and I'm sure we will use that in conversations to come.
Thanks, Leslie.
All right. Thank you, Andrew.